In this mini lecture, I will talk about how oxygen is transported in the blood. So, to begin with, remember that when you inhale, the primary gas that you're inhaling is oxygen. So, it's going to first move into the alveoli in the lungs, and then from there, it's going to diffuse into the bloodstream. And then it needs to be carried by the blood to reach all of your body's cells and your tissues. So, the way that oxygen gets carried in the blood is a very small percentage, only about 1.5% of all the oxygen that's in the blood actually dissolves in blood plasma, which is the liquid portion of blood. And that's because oxygen has a very low solubility coefficient. That's what helps to determine how much of a gas can dissolve in a solution. And because the solubility coefficient for oxygen is so low, only a very, very small amount of oxygen can dissolve in blood. So it's, like I said, only a little bit over 1% of all the oxygen dissolves in blood plasma. By far, the majority of it is carried by hemoglobin, and that's the molecule that is pictured here. So on a hemoglobin molecule, there is the globin part. So that's the coiled up green and purple structures that you see on the diagram. And that is the protein portion of hemoglobin. Then there are 4 heme groups. You can see them 1, 2, 3, 4 throughout the hemoglobin molecule. And the heme groups are iron containing groups. And this is the part of the hemoglobin molecule that binds and carries oxygen. So when oxygen binds to the heme groups on hemoglobin, it forms a molecule that's called oxyhemoglobin. And oxygen molecules will bind to these heme groups one at a time. Every time an oxygen molecule binds to a heme group, it makes it easier for another oxygen to come in and bind to the second heme group. And then that makes it even easier for a third oxygen molecule to come in and bind to the third heme group. So they kind of help each other out by making it easier for more and more oxygen molecules to come in and to bind. So here are a couple pictures of a hemoglobin molecule. These are 4 different hemoglobin molecules. And the gray circles represent the heme groups. There are 4 of these, like we talked about. So when hemoglobin, and I should say the heme groups on hemoglobin, are, each one is attached to an oxygen molecule. So if you have 4 heme groups, there would be 4 oxygen molecules on that hemoglobin. So every heme group is connected to an oxygen molecule. If that is the case, then this hemoglobin is said to be fully saturated. It is holding as many oxygen molecules as possible. The maximum number is 4. If there are any less than 4 oxygen molecules attached to a hemoglobin, so in this case there's 3, 1, 2, 3, over here there are 2, over here there's just 1, these hemoglobin molecules are said to be only partially saturated, not fully saturated. Okay, and there are several factors that control the rate at which hemoglobin binds to or releases oxygen. And I'll list these factors for you, but then I'll explain it a little bit more. So the factors are the partial pressure of oxygen, so basically just the amount of oxygen that's present, temperature, the pH of blood, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and also the amount of BPG, biphosphoglycerate. That is a molecule that's a byproduct of metabolism. So I'll get back to that in just a minute, but I first want to show you the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. On the x-axis, this shows you the partial pressure of oxygen. So this is basically the amount of oxygen that's present. And on the y-axis, this tells you the percent saturation of hemoglobin. So it makes sense, and you can see this on the graph, that the more oxygen that's present, the greater the percent saturation of hemoglobin. So for example, if you have a partial pressure of oxygen that is 20 millimeters of mercury right here, follow that line up till it intersects with the line on the graph, and the percent saturation of hemoglobin is about 40. If you are in an area where there's more oxygen, so maybe there is in a different area of the body, there's 40 millimeters of mercury rather than just 20. So you have more oxygen here. Now the percent saturation of hemoglobin goes up to 75%. So the more oxygen you have in an area, so that's the partial pressure of oxygen, the greater the percent saturation of hemoglobin. All right, so there comes a point where you actually want oxygen to split off of the hemoglobin molecule. And that is once the blood, and remember hemoglobin is found in the blood on red blood cells. So once blood containing hemoglobin reaches your body cells and tissues, now you want oxygen to break off of the hemoglobin so that it can move into your cells and your tissues. So there are several factors that cause that to happen. Whenever there is an increase in carbon dioxide, heat, acid, or BPG, that is going to cause oxygen to break off of hemoglobin. And then once it has unattached from hemoglobin, it's going to move into the closest cell or tissue. So basically these four things, whenever they increase, they affect oxygen's ability to bind to hemoglobin. So it causes oxygen to break away from the hemoglobin. And there's a special name for this effect that when you have an increase in acid or an increase in carbon dioxide specifically, the effect that those two substances have on oxygen's binding is called the Bohr effect. So the Bohr effect is whenever you have an increase in acid or an increase in carbon dioxide, it's going to cause oxygen to break off of hemoglobin. But that's a good thing, that these substances cause oxygen to break off of hemoglobin, because at this point, once blood has reached your body cells and tissues, you want oxygen to break off of hemoglobin and move into the cells and tissues, because cells and tissues need oxygen to be alive and to continue to function properly. Whenever you have a tissue that is very metabolically active, that tissue is going to produce more of these four substances. So if you have a muscle tissue, for example, that is very active, it's going to produce a lot of these four things. And as a result, when you have a lot of these things, it's going to cause a lot of oxygen to break off of hemoglobin and to enter that tissue. And that's a really good thing, because the greater the metabolic activity of a tissue, the greater the need for oxygen by that tissue. So the more active a tissue is, the more of all these substances it's going to produce. and the more it's going to cause oxygen to break away from hemoglobin and move into that tissue. Okay, so hopefully that explains the way that not only that oxygen is carried in the blood, but also some of the factors that affect oxygen's binding to hemoglobin. And that is the way that the majority of oxygen is carried in the blood. About 98.5% of oxygen binds to the heme groups on hemoglobin.